Alrighty. So we'll start by introducing ourselves. My name is Christina Miskey, and my pronouns are she, her, hers, and I'm the Research Impact Librarian.
Hi, I'm Andrea Worth. I'm a scholarly communication librarian. My pronouns are also he, her, she, her, hers. Sorry.
This workshop is part of the library's Research Impact Challenge. Today is day 1 of the challenge. So if you would like to participate in the challenge either today or any of the other days that follow this week, you can visit the Impact Challenge website by going to the link on the slide, which I'll also paste into the chat.
Christina, I can't see the slides.
Oh, I have to reshare. There we go. Okay, now can you see? Now can you see?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. So we'll go over our learning objectives really quickly. So after today's workshop, you should be able to utilize resources to identify reputable open access journals, understand the benefits of publishing open access, identify tools and resources for finding the impact of your open access journals, and be able to deposit your work in UNLV's institutional repository, Digital Scholarship at UNLV. So before we jump into the content of the workshop, we wanted to open it up with a quick question. We'll also have some additional questions pop up throughout the workshop. So once you open it, don't close it. But you can use the QR code on the screen, or you can go to slido.com and type in the hashtag 4519011. And then once you have that open. So our first question is, what is your subject area major?
Should I answer this one?
If you want to. Yay, libraries. Okay, so we'll go ahead and move on. And with that, I'll turn it over to Andrea.
Hello. Yeah, so I'm going to start us off talking a little bit about open access and exactly what that means, how it works, and potentially why you might want to consider publishing open access. So first of all, what does this mean? We certainly hear this phrase a lot. And so to boil it down to a simple and long-standing definition, open access research is digital, online, free of charge to read, and free of most copyright and licensing restrictions. I like to use this definition because it's been around going on 20 years at this point. And while there's variations of open access, which I'll mention in a moment, really the foundation for what open access means is there. All the key components are listed there, such as that it is research, and some other items. So first of all, online, we're talking about anybody with an internet connection. That is a critical part of open access. The works that we're talking about don't have any subscriptions or paywalls or really any other barriers to gaining access. So that could also be registration for a site in order to gain access. So if you do have to register, technically that's not open access. You really want to just be able to go to it, read it, not have to go through any of that. The second part of that definition I just mentioned was free of most copyright and licensing restriction, or in other words, repurposable, reusable in some form. While free to read is a key part of the definition, there is a broad spectrum of what different folks will consider open access in terms of this reusable piece. So it always requires acknowledgement of the original author. It's not about entering the public domain or anything like that. But as far as reusable goes, it might be that the copyright holder has decided not to add any additional perks onto your ability to reuse it. And if you did want to reuse it, you'd go through the same processes that you might for something that wasn't open access. On the other end of the spectrum, you'll see things that are encouraged to be reused. They're licensed very generously for all types of repurposing. You could reprint them in your own anthology, again, with the acknowledgement to the original author. You could take the data or the tables that are in a publication and repurpose them in your own publication for making a point, but again, with acknowledgement to the original author. So that second part has a really broad spectrum there. So that was a very quick, what is open access? I'll talk next about kind of what might be some benefits of publishing open access. Before I do, I will ask the audience just to take a look at this quote underneath this title. UNLV fosters a climate of innovation in which faculty and students produce high quality, widely disseminated, and influential research, scholarship, and creative activities. I won't press the point, but hopefully this looks familiar to many of you. This is straight out of UNLV's Top Tier 2.0 plan. And I think open access very much fits within the intent of this statement. There's, of course, a lot more to this goal of the top tier plan, but in particular, the widely disseminated piece, certainly open access fits there. So again, with why consider open access? I'll start at kind of a higher level that may not be so quite so meaningful to folks as my next slide might be. But initially, I wanted to say that open access really has become a kind of a global concern. So I mentioned that the definition goes back 20 years. Well, I would say at that time, the discussion was a lot about the cost of the subscriptions to the closed access journals, impacts on library budget, and of course to some extent about just the general need for access to information. But I would say there's been a bit of a shift in the last 20 years where truly the conversations about open access and the policies that are being developed are really broadening from local to very international. And a couple of those examples that folks might be familiar with are US federal agencies all being tasked with coming up with public access plans. That is happening as we speak. In Europe, Africa, and Australia, and maybe some other places I forgot to mention, there's a group called the Plan S funders who have agreed to require that if you are getting funding through one of those organizations, you will make the eventual work open access. And then, of course, there's charitable foundations. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, as an example, funds research, and for many years they have required the outputs of those research works to be open access. And then, of course, there's the World Health Organization and other parts of the UN, such as UNESCO. And I pulled an excerpt from UNESCO, and so that's the kind of the environmental sustainability arm of the UN. And one of the things they have in their recent documents is that the knowledge needed to transform innovation systems around the world cannot be accessed. Open science has the potential to not be just an accelerator of knowledge and innovation, but recovery, resilience, and inclusive sustainable development. So this is really just to point out that there's some external factors that may encourage one to publish open access. So perhaps a little bit more reachable for most of us, and at least I know for me, there's some kind of more individualized aspects to benefits. And this is really what this workshop is about, and Christina will be elaborating on this part later. But researchers who don't have access to subscription-based publications. No institution is the same. Even our most highly funded institutions in this country don't have access to every scholarly publication that requires a subscription. UNLV doesn't have the same subscriptions as UNR, et cetera. So just our colleagues at other institutions may not have access to the things that are not open. Oh, can you go back?
Oh, sorry.
And then staff and volunteers at organizations, they may have come out of a discipline that relies very heavily on whatever the latest research is in their area. Again, if their employer is not, or where they're volunteering doesn't provide that access, they won't have it. I've probably heard many times that public or the taxpayers just in their own interest want access to government publications, and to many, the research that's funded by the government would be considered that, although technically it's not government publication. Authors, employers, maybe they want to showcase the work that's coming out of an institution, so that relates to UNLV. Well, UNLV could very easily grab a link to an open access article and share it in UNLV Today, and anybody anywhere that's reading that could get access. A little bit different if it's a subscription-based publication. Alumni, for anybody graduating, you will not, unfortunately, always have access to the resources that UNLV subscribes to. So that's another group. And then, of course, you yourself. And as I mentioned, we'll talk about the impact to individuals a little bit later. So another Slido question for you. Who besides those conducting research in your field might want to read, learn from, report on, or build on your research?
I don't know.
Yeah, so this is a question to kind of help think about, based on that information relating to your own research, who might be interested in that.
Oh.
Oh, yeah. Andrea, can you see the answers?
I can. Yes, on the same page there. Awesome. Thank you so much for participating. All right, so that's great. Open access. Hopefully I've made a case for why you might want to consider it. I should mention this is the shortened version of an open access overview. So join me at the end of October for a little bit deeper look at open access. But anyway, moving on. A key piece of this is, okay, so now you want to publish open access. How do you find those things? So we have the directory of open access journals. That is a free global resource. That's a curated list of many, many open access journals. There's a process by which journals go through to get into that directory. And I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment. And then also I like to mention our research databases because I don't know that people think of this as a resource for discovery of open access journals that often. So if you use Web of Science or Scopus, just to take two examples, these are multidisciplinary databases, cover many thousands of journals generally. But among those journals, they each include more than 5,000 journals at this point. And why I mention that is because you might use these databases and be most familiar with them when you're starting your literature review, which is great. And at that point, you wouldn't necessarily want to filter those results on any particular type of publication model of journal. However, when you're at the other end of your research, and maybe you've fine-tuned whatever it is you're looking to produce, you can go and conduct a similar search and limit the results to the open access journals in there solely for the purpose of kind of seeing which of those journals rise to the top, which ones are most frequently publishing in your journal. And by rise to the top, I mean number of citations you're using or something like that, and potentially select a journal from there. If you'd like to know more about that or see a demo, I'd be happy to help anyone with that. Of course, there's also some indirect resources in addition to these tools. So similar to your searching of these databases, your paper's reference list as you're creating it, maybe there's some journals you're seeing over and over again. There probably are. And maybe within those, there's a couple of open access journals. You, of course, would need to look up the journals to find out what publication model they're using. And then just really quickly, there's other scholars, such as current and former co-authors, advisors, and mentors. And then trust yourself. We've all evaluated websites. I know I do that on a regular basis. Other types of resources we're using. When you land on that journal page that you think might be perfect for you, trust your instincts. Use, the skills that we've all developed over the years to kind of navigate the online world. So just a little bit more about the DOAJ. It's up to nearly 20,000 journals at this point. I know they're eagerly awaiting their 20,000th so that they can celebrate that milestone. I haven't checked in a couple of days, so maybe they've gotten there. And next slide. And so I think I'll skip this in the interest of time, but I did want to put this here for the sharing of slides or the viewing of this video later. And I encourage you to visit the Directory of Open Access Journals when you're not in a crunch to find that journal or to evaluate a journal that you're considering. Take some time on your own to look to see if you can find a journal in your field. When you're doing that, I recommend searching broadly. It's not a very savvy subject-based search for journals. It's also an article database, but as far as searching through journal subjects, it's pretty limited. So you want to start broad. But once you do that search, you can use some pretty powerful filtering, just as you would expect in other database resources, to limit to, if you have some publishers in mind that you're really looking for, maybe you've heard good things, or you want to limit to a particular set of languages that you're interested in publishing in. You can do that all in their search interface. And then even beyond that, take some time to look at the snapshot of what DOAJ provides about each journal. And again, I don't have time to show that today, but you will have some good information there, such as how much they charge to publish, called an article processing charge, if they do at all. Most of the journals in DOAJ do not actually charge to publish. They'll have links to the website, links to their policies, and then information about the record itself. So identifying journals, in addition to using the tools that I just talked about, maybe you just get an invitation for a journal, publish with us, or maybe you've got a whole slew of them and you just need to kind of have a method for going through them and figuring out which ones look legitimate, which ones look like the best, so not just legitimate. We have two good resources listed here. So Think, Check, Submit is really robust and is created by a group of organizations that runs through quite a number of different things. So it's a little bit lengthy, but it's incredibly valuable. And again, makes us go back to thinking about how we would evaluate these journals kind of separate from the anxiety of needing to publish. And so could go to that, and then there's also that author's checklist for evaluating journals, excuse me. That was created locally. It will probably be getting a bit of an update in the next few months, but it's still good. And it's a shortened version, basically, of some of the things that are on Think, Check, Submit. But both of these tools consider how familiar you are with the publication, taking a look at how the publication is run and its policies, evidence of good practices. Back to that clarity of costs for any authors, that is so critical. That is a huge red flag if there is not clarity around the costs. And then similarly, transparency in all of the above items. So both of these are good resources for that. With that, I hand it over to Christina.
So besides publishing in journals, like Andrea was talking about, there are some other ways that you can share your work openly online. So we'll dive into a few of the different options. So digital repositories are online collections of resources, and in the context that we're talking about, they often contain scholarly, creative, and/or the intellectual output of a group. There are three main types of repositories in this context, which are institutional, that are an archive for collecting, preserving, and disseminating the digital copies of an intellectual output of an institution. Discipline-specific, also known as subject repositories. These are digital archives containing scholarly works or data in a particular subject area or discipline. And then generalist repositories can be used by anyone in any subject area. They may also be funder specific, so you'll want to pay attention to that as well. So depending on your unique needs, you may choose any of these to share your research in. Andrea?
So I'll just pop back in briefly to tell you about our local institutional repository. So the first type of repository Christina talked about. So we have digital scholarship at UNLV. And while we can add faculty and students open access journal articles into this repository, it's actually a really great open access option for paywalled and subscription-based journals. And so just to shift thinking a little bit, and again, not too much time to spend on this, more at the end of October in a different workshop. But we can actually take advantage both of what copyright allows and even more importantly in this case, what a whole bunch of publishers, big ones, little ones, allow in terms of the author resharing their work. So you could publish in whatever journal you want, and probably there's a very good chance that the publisher is going to allow the author to make use of their final accepted manuscript. So again, this is UNLV's institutional repository. We do accept postprints. That's the final accepted manuscript of articles, again, within copyright and publisher permission, and they become free to read. So most of them will not become free to reuse in any unique way. A few of them, depending on the publisher, maybe. But it's kind of at that one end of the spectrum where at least folks are getting access to reading. And again, some of these journals, many of these journals do allow this. Some of them even encourage it. So there's a whole broad spectrum of the publishers out there and what they allow. And then there's a ton of companies. So I just wanted to make a brief mention that while we're talking about scholarly publishing and journals, primarily, really this is where we keep our theses and dissertations and a whole bunch of other content that UNLV produces. So it's a very robust repository.
Definitely. So besides the digital repositories that we just mentioned, there's also other ways to share your research and components of your research. So for example, there's data repositories that allow you to share the data from a scholarly or research project online, which may be required as part of the publication process by the journal or by a grant funding agency if you've received funding. There's also preprint servers where authors can share their pre-publication work with others in their field to obtain feedback and insight into projects before they become official publications. And so here on this slide, I have a few different examples of the types of repositories that I was just referring to. So Andrea just talked about digital scholarship at UNLV, which is this one here at the top. That's UNLV's institutional repository, and it contains student and faculty scholarly and creative work. Figshare, right here, is a generalist repository where authors can share their research and their data depending on their specific needs in any subject area. There's ICPSR, or the Inter-Consortium Political and Social Research Repository, which is a mouthful. This is a data repository that caters primarily to political and social science disciplines. There's PLOS, which is the Public Library of Science. It's a multi-purpose database that houses journals, preprints, and more. And then there's Archive, and there's a whole series of preprint servers just like this. So Archive is a preprint server. It was one of the first ones that existed in this strain. And it focuses on physics and related sciences, but there's hundreds of these in all kinds of disciplines now. And then there's SSRN, or the Social Science Research Network. This is an interdisciplinary repository that focuses mainly on preprints, but also contains other types of research and conference papers. And then Zenodo is a repository for clinical and scientific research that's run by CERN and NASA. So that's just a few examples. There's literally hundreds of repositories out there. And as you can see from those few examples that I just showed, and from what Andrea shared with you earlier about journals, there's tons of options that exist. On this slide, I have some things that you'll want to consider when thinking about sharing your research in a repository. Andrea did share some tools that will help you to think about different repository and publication options and to make the best decisions for you and your research. So first, you'll want to consider copyright. If you have a published version of your article, are there any restrictions or requirements from the publisher that you should consider before sharing your work openly? You'll want to make sure that you're aware of these restrictions, as well as your rights as an author when publishing open access or even traditionally. Next, you'll want to consider the cost. Many open access repositories are free to publish in and or free to access. The same thing with journals. But you'll want to make sure that you read all the repository's guidelines and information before sharing to ensure that you know if there's any hidden costs or unexpected ones. You also want to think about how your work will be preserved in the long term. So are there any end dates to the repository storing your research? Do they have storage size limitations that you need to consider if you have large files you want to share? Consider making sure that your work will be accessible long term by making sure the repository uses reliable formats for sharing your work, and that they use persistent identifiers such as DOIs, which help provide permanent access to your work. And then finally, you want to think about your ability to track the impact of your work in the repository, and how they share that information with you. So we're going to dive a little bit deeper to that in the next section coming up. So let's dive a little bit deeper into the impact of publishing open access and how it can potentially positively influence the reach of your scholarship. So first, I want to start with a definition of what impact is. So impact is the effect that research has in the field, in academia, and beyond that. Measuring impact helps us to understand how far our research goes, who's interested in it, and a lot more. So there's this phenomenon that you may or may not have heard of called the open access citation advantage. This concept has been studied several times in the past 20 or more years. And what many studies have found is that open access publications tend to be cited with more frequency than pay to access publications. The reason for this is because more scholars, including the general public and those not affiliated with a major institution, or those living in a developing country, can read and download open access publications. I do want to add that the open access citation advantage phenomenon refers to the potential for more citations due to the accessibility of openly available scholarship. As with any scholarship, whether it's open access or not, there's never a guarantee that an article or a publication will receive publications or citations, not publications. So in addition to citations, open access publications can also have their impact measured in lots of other ways. Since most publications are now available online, there are methods for tracking and measuring how publications are interacted with. Some examples include views and downloads, mentions and shares, generally on social media sites or professional networking sites, references in sites such as Wikipedia, in news media, or in professional blogs. Open access publications also have their broader influence tracked by seeing how policy documents, for example, cite and use them to improve local, state, national, or even international policies. You could also consider measuring their influence by seeing how a publication contributes to the larger scholarly community or helps the general public. So now I'm going to share some examples of open access articles that have some impact, so you can see real world examples of how publishing open access might help increase the reach of your scholarly work. So with that, I'm going to there we go. Okay, so this is the weird thing about having two separate weird screens. So this first article is from Nature and Aging Journal. It's called Designing the Next Generation Clinical Care Pathway for Alzheimer's Disease. And so this first article discusses clinical care for pathways for Alzheimer's. And as you can see, not only are people talking about this article around the world on social media sites. So you can see this is the geographic impact of people talking about it in South America, in Europe, in Saudi Arabia, and even New Zealand and Australia. You can also see that this article in particular was mentioned in over 50 news articles around the world. Many of them are foreign language outlets, which also indicates an international audience for this particular article. There we go. Maybe not. There we go. Okay. So the second article is in the journal Past and Present, and it's called Slave Hounds and Abolition in the Americas. So this article was published in a history journal, and while it doesn't have very many citations, you can see it only has 3 here. It does have a large amount of online interaction. So you can see this article has received over 43,000 views, which means that it's attracted a wide audience. You can also see, if I look at the alternative metrics for this article, that it's also received a huge following around the world, and 74% of the interactions online have been from members of the general public. So something like this has significantly impacted members of the general public. And of course it's going to do this. There we go. Okay. Then this third article is from Research and Politics, and this is a political science journal, and it's PACS in January 6th, Campaign Finance and Objections to the Electoral College Vote Count. So this article was published in a political science journal, and at first glance, it doesn't appear to have the same amount of influence as others. Because it's a little bit of a smaller number. However, if you go down to the general public interaction, you can see 77% of the interactions online were from members of the public. So this means that even though it doesn't have a ton of interaction, it's still largely reaching folks online and the general public. So that's just a couple of examples. So we've thrown a lot of information at you so far today, but before we begin to wrap up this workshop, we wanted to give you some key takeaways. Keep in mind that you don't have to start doing all of the things that we've recommended throughout the workshop, but we hope that we've shared something with you that will have a positive outcome for your future research. So some of the key takeaways we want you to walk away with includes open scholarship is free to view, download, and reuse. Ideally, it would also be free to publish. In reputable open access journals, publish in reputable open access journals, or learn how to share your work openly if it's in a pay-to-access journal. You want to share your work in other ways, such as repositories or on preprint servers, to get feedback from others in your field as an alternative. Your work is more accessible when it's open, so it will have a greater impact. There's lots of resources available to you, whether online or at UNLV, so make sure you use them to help you find the best place to publish for you. And you'll want to consider how your work can be accessed and how publishing open can benefit you as a researcher. So we have one last question. What's something you learned today that you might use in your future projects? And thanks for humoring us. Oh, fantastic. There we go. So we'll quickly move on so it's not weird. So we have upcoming workshops, which you heard Andrea mention a few different times. So for the Research Impact Challenge, coming up on Wednesday, we have the Researcher's Guide to Citation-Based Metrics. On Thursday, we have using alt metrics to show impact beyond the citation. So if you can attend those, we can put registration links. If you want, I can send them to you directly if you want them. And then there's also a couple other workshops. So there's get all your questions answered about OA. This is an in-person lobby event, so you don't have to register for that. And then the last one is Introduction to Open Access, which is during Open Access Week. And that's going to dive a lot deeper to the brief overview that Andrea shared today. Andrea, is there anything else you want to add about your events?
Only that there will likely be some library swag and an easy game at the table on the 24th.
Yes.
So I encourage participation.
Yes. I will also say that tomorrow there's going to be an Orchid pop-up table in the Lead Library lobby from 10:30 to 1, which will also have Orchid swag and some other stuff. So come if you want help setting up your Orchid account. And with that, that is our workshop. So contact us if you have any questions. Our email addresses are on the slide. And with that, I'm going to pause the recording.